This is the B-24, the bomber they called Liberator. She was designed to streak through the air at 300 miles per hour, carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs and drop them 3,000 miles away. Although she had one of the most graceful wing foils ever designed, the Davis wing, the rest of her looked like an ox with its legs cut off and porcupine quills sticking out all over it. The porcupine quills were a variety of guns, from 50 caliber machine guns to 20mm cannons. 16 nations bought and flew her during and after the Second World War. She was the personal plane of Winston Churchill, and she had the dubious distinction of being the first American plane to be lost in World War II. There wasn't a pocket anywhere in the war that wasn't rocked by her bombs. But the Liberator had a hard time earning respect. The sleek B-17 Flying Fortress, designed 5 years before the Liberator, seemed to get all the glory. The Fortress was easy to handle, easy to maintain. She got her pilots and crews home, which made her easy to love. But the Liberator could carry more bombs further and put them on target faster than the 17 ever could. She could also bring a crew back from near certain catastrophe after being ripped open by enemy fire. Though not much of a glamour horse, the B-24 Liberator had no equal as a workhorse in World War II. Probably the most famous mission flown by the Liberator were the raids on the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. Ploiești was a rich industrial area 35 miles north of Bucharest, the capital city of Romania, which supplied Hitler with nearly 1/3 of the oil necessary to move the German army. Luftwaffe Colonel Albert Gerstenberg, regarded by many as the air defense genius of the war, was given the mission of protecting the refineries from Allied bombers. There were 11 refineries in and around Ploiești. If ever there was a juicy bomber target, Ploiești was it, and Hitler knew it. Using the labor of Romanian workers and Russian prisoners of war, Gerstenberg built a ring of anti-aircraft positions around Ploiești. Then he tied the 11 refineries together by a pipeline so that if one was hit, the others could simply pick up the slack. But he went much further than just physical protection. He installed an intricate early warning system to detect threats from the air hundreds of miles from Ploiești. Except for a nuisance bombing in 1942, Ploiești enjoyed 2 years of near tranquility. Gerstenberg never allowed that tranquility to lull him into a false sense of security. He knew the Allies would come. He just didn't know when. To keep his soldiers at a high state of readiness, Gerstenberg had constant, almost daily alerts that scrambled his aircraft and sharpened his soldiers. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away at Benghazi, on the desert of North Africa, American B-24 crews trained for a top-secret mission to take the tranquility away from Ploiești. Its code name was Tidal Wave. It was to be the first of several major raids on Ploiești. Benghazi was not the most pleasant place to train, especially if you had an aversion to wind and sand. At Benghazi, the Americans got a generous dose of both. The B-24 flight groups bore names like Flying Circus, Pyramiders, 8 Balls, Liberandos, and Sky Scorpions. Altogether, 177 B-24s would participate in the raid. Flying 70,000 pounds of airplane 10 feet off the desert floor at 200 miles an hour wasn't what the designers of the B-24 had in mind. The crews called the 24 Elephant, or Pregnant Cow, and they didn't know where they were going to have to fly those pregnant cows. Flying low on the desert, it seemed like they were training for a mission better suited for torpedo planes. No one guessed the target was Ploesti. But in spite of the wind and the sand and the unknown, training in those elephants went on. Finally, the last week in July, the men training at Benghazi were told that their target was Ploesti. Preparation for the Ploesti raid was very thorough. For the first time in the history of war, men going into battle were shown a motion picture of their target. The movie used scale models of Ploesti shot from different angles with a camera mounted on a tricycle.
How well the valley shows up behind the target. And note the oil derricks to the south of the target. These are your targets. The white arrow on the screen points to the boiler house and powerhouse, without which your refinery cannot operate. This arrow points to the distillation plant. This next arrow also points to another section of the same distillation plant. And finally, this arrow to the cracking plant. All these points are vital parts of the target. And these are the refineries which you are not going to attack. They are not worth a bomb. Not this one. Not this one. Nor this one. And not this one. The aircraft on the screen are on the line of your run-up to the target. This is the line of attack. The fighter defenses of Ploesti are not strong, and the majority of the fighters will be flown by Romanian pilots who are thoroughly bored with the war. The anti-aircraft defenses of Ploesti are estimated at 80 heavy AA guns and 160 light AA guns. The heavy ack should not trouble you at low altitude. All the anti-aircraft guns are manned by Romanians. And so there's a pretty good chance that there may be incidents like there were in Italy at the beginning of the war, when civilians could not get into the shelters because they were filled with anti-aircraft gunners. You remember the raid on Tokyo? That was a big job and an important job. And the first daylight raid on Europe by our flying fortresses, that was another big job. The Nazis and the Wops ain't felt nothing yet. The job of knocking out the Romanian refineries is the biggest job of the war. It's your job. Okay, let's hit it.
Sunday morning, August the 1st, 1943. The Liberators at Operation Tidal Wave took off to bomb Ploesti. Their wheels had scarcely left the surface of the runway when things started going wrong. On takeoff, a Sky Scorpion had engine failure. As the pilot banked the plane, his wing caught a telephone pole and cartwheeled into the African desert in flames. Out of a crew of 10, only 2 badly burned men survived. Because of the secrecy surrounding the mission, radio silence was in force. One message had to be sent, however, the message alerting Allied anti-aircraft positions in southern Europe of Allied planes in the sky. That one message was intercepted in Greece by a German signal unit, which immediately alerted all possible German targets for hundreds of miles around. Now they were flying deeper into enemy territory than any Allied mission had ever ventured, and without fighter escort. Ploesti was simply out of range of our fighters. And the plan, so precise in its detail, so thoroughly rehearsed, continued to unravel. About halfway to the target, the lead ship, carrying the only navigator specifically trained to lead the Liberators into Ploesti, inexplicably plunged to Earth and crashed. What happened next was a series of errors made by men under pressure coping with the situation as they saw it. Timing was an essential element in the success of the mission, and timing depended on the spacing of the aircraft. But instead of a well-spaced task force, the Liberators of Operation Tidal Wave were spread out all over the sky, with whole groups having difficulty keeping up with the leaders. As the ragged formation of Liberators climbed to 16,000 feet to fly over the mountains of Yugoslavia, they were picked up by radar stations at Ploesti. Colonel Gerstenberg quickly guessed that his tranquility was about to end. The German garrison were alerted, and the anti-aircraft crews manned the 80 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 160 light AA guns that defended the city. Then, after 7 hours in the air, as the Liberators closed on Ploesti, another inexplicable event happened. The lead plane, thinking it had crossed the final checkpoint, made a wrong turn. Others followed. When the mistake was realized, the only course of action left to the commander was to abandon his original plan and improvise. He ordered his Liberators to scatter and hit targets of opportunity. And as the Liberators searched for targets, Romanian pilots scrambled to defend the oil fields and bring down the Liberators. The Ploesti raid was planned with great precision. Delayed action bombs were part of that precision. The delayed action would allow following planes time to clear the target before bombs under them would go off. Precise spacing of the aircraft was essential. And because of the disorder of the formation, the precision was gone. And as the B-24s made their bombing runs at treetop level through murderous anti-aircraft fire, bombs dropped by leading Liberators were exploding directly under following planes as they dropped their own bombs. Ironically and tragically, many B-24s were destroyed by exploding bombs from their own formations. The exploding bombs also caused a visibility problem at that low altitude, resulting in B-24s crashing into each other and crashing into obstacles on the ground. The raid lasted 27 minutes, but when the B-24s turned away from Ploesti, the misery of the Liberator crews was far from over. Benghazi, Libya, was hundreds of miles away. After the raid, the Liberators that survived their bombing runs were now attacked by fighters for the second time. As the Liberators returned to their base, the extent of the disaster became evident. 1/3 of the aircraft that left on the mission did not return. 20% of all the crew members were killed. It was the worst air disaster in American air history. And although significant damage had been done, the oil refineries at Ploesti were still functioning. The primary reason the B-24 was used in the Ploesti raid was range. The Navy, responsible for war on the seas, was facing an old problem: German submarines. Nothing in the Navy inventory had the range necessary to effectively counter the U-boat problem. In 1917, German U-boats had successfully cut Great Britain's Atlantic Ocean supply lines. Once again, submarines were seen as the means of denying the Allies the material necessary to wage war. The German High Command planned to launch 300 new subs by 1942, 900 by 1944. In the first 6 months of 1942, 506 Allied freighters were sunk by German U-boats. The Navy, frustrated in its attempts to stop the Germans at sea, knew they needed a weapon with speed, range, and firepower. They knew the Liberator had all three. And the request went out to the Air Corps to send the Liberators. Operating from bases ashore and flying ahead of the freighter convoys, the B-24 searched the seas for German periscopes. When a sub was spotted, the B-24 attacked with bombs. The tactic worked. The Navy had found its weapon. And the German plan of dominating the seas by undersea warfare sank to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Liberator, designated PB-4Y by the Navy and Marine Corps, patrolled the Pacific Ocean's 64 million square miles, combat-loaded, ready to attack in an instant. She was by far the best patrol bomber of World War II. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is considered one of the turning points of the war in the Pacific. The battle came about because a lone B-24 on patrol spotted a Japanese convoy moving in the Bismarck Sea towards New Guinea. 162 American and Australian planes responded to the alert by that lone Liberator. For 3 days, 162 American and Australian planes attacked the convoy. When it was over, the Allies had lost 6 planes, but the Japanese had lost an entire combat division. Although the B-24 had proven herself a patrol craft without equal, she was still primarily a bomber. And because of her range, General MacArthur could conceive a daring new tactic which proved very effective in the island warfare of the Pacific. The tactic was simply bypassing enemy strongpoints by attacking deep in the Japanese rear and thereby gaining air superiority behind them. This tactic was tried first at Manda. The combination of bombing and strafing resulted in the loss of 350 enemy aircraft. Once Manda was taken by air, it was turned into an Allied base. Liberators also had a role in the aerial invasion of New Guinea. As the Japanese swept all opposition before them in 1941 and 42, they constructed an intricate web of air and sea bases throughout the Pacific Basin as far south as New Guinea. Most of these bases were within 150 miles of each other and were mutually supportive. To reconquer the Pacific, we had to disassemble that interlocking web. On August 17, 1942, Liberators attacked Wewak. One 115 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Considerable damage was done to ships in the harbor. Then the Liberators struck Hansa Bay. Then Alexishaven, where Japan had stockpiled men and supplies for the forward areas. Next, Cape Gloucester came under attack. Up and down the coast of New Guinea, Liberator bombs shook the earth, knocking out air bases, storage yards, marshalling points, communication centers, and ships at harbor. In 1941, the Allies in the Pacific were demoralized and almost defeated, but with each Liberator bomb dropped, each island or base recaptured, confidence returned. And by 1943, we could turn from contemplating defeat to considering victory. By early 1944, the German industrial machine was turning out nearly one plane every 15 minutes. The Allies were already planning an invasion of Western Europe. But for those plans to succeed, German industry had to be crippled. By February, the weather over Germany had cleared. The generals made their plans as the air crews readied their aircraft. The target was the industrial might of Germany. Factories, foundries, road systems, canals, railroads, anything that supplied the German army. This was to be the largest concentration of Allied air power of the war, and the Liberators had a major role to play. This was a big mission, and big losses were expected. It was estimated that up to 200 Allied planes would be lost. Germany was to be hit for 6 consecutive days. The Luftwaffe had anticipated the Allied air offensive, and German fighters had been massed in anticipation. And the battle was joined. But the Liberators got through, and German industry disintegrated under the pounding of our bombs. But there was more to the industrial strength of Germany than factories that made tanks and bombs and planes. Tanks and planes needed fuel. The Allies planned to stop that flow. By early spring of 1944, Allied forces had routed the German army from North Africa and fought their way up the boot of Italy. Plans were underway for the Normandy invasion. The German army was far from defeated, however, and despite repeated bombing, the intricate supply system that supplied Hitler's armies with the material of war was still intact. The Allied success in Italy meant air forces, initially concentrated in North Africa, could now be moved closer to the Nazi homeland. Now targets formerly on the periphery of our target lists now could receive primary attention. The oil fields at Ploesti fell into that category. Generals Spaatz and Acre arrived for a planning conference with 15th Air Force Commander General Nathan Twining.
Gentlemen, you have just received a directive establishing target priorities for the bomber offensive of the 15th Air Force. The decision has been announced. We will destroy oil refineries and synthetic oil plants. Now, Colonel Young, what does our intelligence show us in regard to these targets within our area?
More than 50% of the refineries and synthetic plants producing gasoline for the Axis are within range of the 15th Air Force. Between 25 and 30% of the total Axis production of gasoline is represented by the 10 large refineries around Ploesti. While these refineries were seriously damaged in the attack last August by the task force operating from Egypt, recent photo reconnaissance reveals that, with one exception, all refineries are currently operating at full capacity.
Gentlemen, you've heard the problem. It's a big job we've got ahead. The knockout of Ploesti means the German will be deprived of 1/3 of his oil resources.
On April 5th, 94 B-17s and 136 Liberators took off for Ploesti. They flew over the Adriatic Sea, Albania, and the mountains of Yugoslavia. Here, the first guns of the German anti-aircraft network protecting Ploesti sighted in on the task force. Instead of attacking at treetop level as they had in 1943, the bombers attacked at 24,000 feet. And they were met at that high altitude by 250 German fighter planes, 3 times the number of Allied fighters escorting our bombers. When the German fighters moved off, 256 flak guns opened up from positions encircling Ploesti. One of the elements that proved so disastrous in the 1943 raid was poor visibility. Remembering this, the German defenders added smoke pots to their defensive tactics and made accurate visual bombing impossible. Over the next month, Liberators and flying fortresses returned again and again to the murky skies over Ploesti. But despite the heavy pounding, the Germans were still pumping oil. By June, American planners were ready to try another tactic. Instead of bombers, P-38 fighters were fitted with bombs and ordered to dive bomb the refineries. This new tactic proved very effective, and it had a very beneficial side effect. When the P-38s completed their dive bombing runs, they switched roles, zeroed in on German fighters, and continued the attack. But although this proved a very effective 1-2 punch, it didn't stop the flow of oil. Ploesti was getting under everyone's skin. The campaign had cost the crews of 189 bombers and 41 fighters. 1,900 men had been lost, and the job still wasn't finished. Then in early August, General Twining called his commanders together again and gave them their mission.
This strategical air force, during the next 3 days, will attack continuously, night and day, with maximum effort against all refineries in the area.
Then the heavy bombers, the fortresses, and the Liberators, now equipped with special aiming devices designed for poor visibility situations, resumed bombing. And now it was unrelenting. We were determined to stop the flow of oil from Romania once and for all. Maximum effort began to pay off as the full weight of American air power fell on Ploesti. In the end, there was little left of the refineries but smoke and twisted metal. It was too much for the Germans to put together again, and a third of Hitler's oil was effectively choked off. But the loss was high, and the statistics grim. In 1944 alone, 270 heavy bombers went down with their crews during raids on the oil fields. But amazingly, many of those crews had survived the crash of their planes and were taken prisoner. And soon after the last bombs had fallen on Ploesti, Romania surrendered to the Russian army. Within days of the surrender, 1,100 of those missing American flyers were on their way back to American lines and reunited with their buddies. For the Liberator, Ploesti had been a long campaign. The Germans considered the raids on Ploesti the most serious bombing loss of the war. It had taken 5 months of concentrated bombing to do the job. But it was over, and the taste of victory was sweet. While the Air Force was dealing with Ploesti in Eastern Europe, Allied troops prepared to attack Western Europe at Normandy. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower and Generals Spaatz and Reardon visited troops of the 82nd Airborne, who would drop into Normandy on the following day. Eisenhower had been ordered to attack the continent of Europe. He had chosen Normandy as the site of the invasion. And as the ground forces prepared to hit the beaches and drop zones of France, they knew the way had been cleared by Allied bombers. In the days just prior to D-Day, 84 bridges and tunnels, countless miles of railroad track, locomotives, barges, anything that could assist the German army in delivering material to the battlefront had been destroyed by Liberators and other bombers. Just before the landing, B-24s softened up the beach one last time. Then the infantry hit the beach. And once ashore, we stayed ashore. Try as they did, the German army could not push us back into the sea. But Germany was far from defeated, and commanders like Third Army Commander General George Patton had to find new and innovative ways of dealing with the Germans. First, carpet bombing knocked a hole in the formidable German line around Normandy. Then, using air to cover his flanks and act as eyes for his tanks, Patton broke through the hedgerows of France and Belgium and smashed towards the German homeland 400 miles away. General Eisenhower had promised his men that if they saw an aircraft in the sky, it would be ours. And that was true. And this was in large part due to our relentless bombing of the German means of production. But that means of production began showing remarkable recuperative powers. And late in 1944, General Spaatz reported to Washington that the Luftwaffe had more planes than at the beginning of the war. Hitler had been holding them back for the defense of the homeland. Now he turned them loose. So the job wasn't finished, the objective not yet won. There was yet work for the Liberators to do, and the skies over Germany became the domain of the Liberator. The Nazi war machine was not only going to be stopped, not only defeated, it was to be utterly destroyed.
Getting set now. Mr. Gunn, okay. Pilot to navigator. What's the word? Navigator to pilot. Approaching target. Check. There it is, the end of the line. Wait for the pilot. Mark at 7 o'clock. Coming in close. Okay, Jimmy, I see it. Pilot to bombardier. Take it over for the run. Right. We're making the run. Bomb base open. Keep heading 340. popping all over the place. Yeah, they're getting our range. We've been hit. There goes our left inboard. Alpha reader calling formation leader. Rear reader calling leader. Port engine gone. Looks like we gotta leave you. Over. Well, there they go. Pilot and crew. We're on our own. Bandits bouncing from 9 o'clock high. Bandits bouncing from 9 o'clock high. Climbing on through. Stay with me. Hang on. You've nicked him. Got it. Keep pouring it in. I got him. I got him. He popped. Still coming. Give that one diving through. Got him. Nice going. Well, we're in the clear now. Control tower from Army 127. Control tower, over. Army 127 from control. Try to make it on runway 2. Land east to west. Over.
Now the thin line that separated military targets from civilian targets was erased as Allied bombers dropped their bombs indiscriminately on Germany. And so it was over in Europe. Grim German officers, who only 4 years earlier dared dream of a world under German domination, now faced the reality of defeat. General Spaatz, who had directed the Allied air effort in Europe, represented the Air Force at the surrender ceremonies. But while victory was ours in Europe, in Asia and the Pacific, the outcome was not so clear. On the Chinese mainland, the Japanese were on the move. General Claire Chennault's game little 14th Air Force had held the Japanese at bay along a 5,000-mile front for as long as they could. Now they had to do what it was perhaps the most difficult job a soldier must do: destroy that which he had had a hand in building. And in a matter of days, airfields and buildings that had taken an army of Chinese coolies years to build was blown to bits at the hand of Americans by American bombs. But it was done, and the edge was taken off the Japanese advance. And even as we pulled back in China, General MacArthur and Kenny were planning our next advance in the Pacific, and the Liberator was at the center of those plans. With the bold assurance of victory ahead, the combined sea, land, and air power of the Allies attacked the Philippine Islands. And we took back what had been taken from us. Here, a contingent of 12 officers who had been evacuated with MacArthur from Corregidor 3 years before returned to witness its recapture and salute the soldiers and airmen who had liberated the islands. And with the fall of the Philippines, little remained of the would-be Japanese empire except the homeland itself. The people of the land of the rising sun who had sought to subjugate the people of the Pacific Basin. But aboard the battleship Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, all of Japan's dreams of conquest came to an end as representatives of Emperor Hirohito signed the Declaration of Surrender. And so it was over in the Pacific. And the B-24 Liberator had played its part. She wasn't the prettiest airplane in the sky, but the Liberator was one of the most important aircraft in aviation history, but not for obvious reasons. She was conceived 5 years after the Flying Fortress, and in many ways she was inferior to the B-17, especially in ease of handling. But the B-24 was one of the most complicated aircraft ever built. She was a harbinger of things to come. The Liberator was built in greater numbers, nearly 20,000, in more versions and for more purposes than any American aircraft in history. In terms of sheer industrial effort, there was nothing, no project of any kind that had ever come close to it. To the B-24 Liberator, that elephant in the sky, and all of the men who flew her, accept our salute for a job well done.